Hi there. Even though Street Fighter II was a cultural phenomenon of the 1990s, Capcom would spend the rest of that decade rejecting its own legacy and allowing the Street Fighter series to change and evolve in new and exciting ways. Those changes could be felt in its choices of characters, game mechanics, and most important to me, the music. In my last video, I used the many iterations of Chun-Li's theme as a means to track the evolution of the Street Fighter sound. From Yoko Shimomura's original Street Fighter II composition, all the way up to Hideki Okugawa's radically different approach for 1999's Street Fighter III Third Strike, Chun-Li's theme has consistently been emblematic of the series' broader musical changes. But that was just the beginning of the story. The 21st century would bring with it many changes for Street Fighter, with some of its highest highs and lowest lows. Today we're going to be looking at Street Fighter IV and the ways its composer, Hideyuki Fukusawa, helped bring the series back from the precipice of irrelevancy. I'm Patrick Rainville, and this is Street Fighter's Evolution of Sound. Following the release of Third Strike in 1999 and Arika's EX3 in the year 2000, both of which continued the series' trend away from yesteryear's massive mainstream popularity, the series began a very long dormant period. Sure, Capcom was still putting out the occasional port and spin-off during this time, but for a series that released a staggering 2 to 3 titles and revisions during each year of the 1990s, this was a massive shift. However, if Capcom noticed, I don't think they cared. In the 2000s, they had bigger fish to fry. The 6th generation of consoles was a veritable goldmine for Capcom, introducing the world to new and returning long-running franchises like Devil May Cry, Onimusha, and Monster Hunter. Oh, and a little something called Resident Evil 4. Maybe you've heard of it. Inevitably, during this period, Capcom's remaining Street Fighter composers would shift over to working on the company's more popular series. To this day, the vast majority of those composers would never work on another Street Fighter title again. It was a new century with a strong cultural shift away from the increasingly dated, quote-unquote, arcade experience, a change Capcom seemed plenty aware of. Street Fighter, once the undisputed brightest jewel in the company's crown, soundly slept the decade away. And yet, in the middle of its slumber, the sound of Street Fighter was never louder. At 2004's Evolution Fighting Game Tournament in Pomona, California, with a sliver of health remaining in the Street Fighter III Third Strike Losers Final, Ken, controlled by Daigo Umehara, the best player from the East, parried all 15 hits of Chun-Li's Super Art, controlled by Justin Wong, the best player from the West, and went on to win the series. From the "Let's go, Justin" to jazzy NYC in the background, to the elated cries of the crowd much too loud for the camcorder's brittle microphone to handle, Evo Moment 37 was the screaming embodiment of what had been lost in the half-decade since Street Fighter had fully vanished from the mainstream, and was instrumental in revitalizing the social and cultural relevance of the series, priming the world for its now inevitable comeback. And come back it did. In 2008, Street Fighter IV finally made its arcade debut. Bringing with it high-definition 3D polygonal environments and character models, and more than a few familiar faces.
Street Fighter IV.
But as bold and flashy as Street Fighter IV looked, Capcom needed this game to be a huge hit, and that meant doubling down on the nucleus of the series' nostalgia, Street Fighter II. Gone were the more complex game mechanics introduced in later titles, like Alpha's isms and 3's universal parry systems. Similarly, the entire cast of new characters from the SF3 games all sat out 4's arcade launch. In their place was the entire original Street Fighter II World Warriors roster and a handful of new original characters. 4 was a safe, arguably regressive sequel, but in a series defined by its constant need for reinvention, this was a much-needed reminder and celebration of just what made Street Fighter so damn good in the first place. Paired with its striking new visual style and a new, easy-to-use focus mechanic, Street Fighter IV was a near-perfect blend of nostalgia and freshness. And so it should come as little surprise then that the game's soundtrack would follow a similar mix of old and new. Every returning character is saddled with a new, high-octane, electronica arrangement of their original theme. That means all of the Yoko Shimomura, Isao Abe, and Shun Nishigaki composed Street Fighter II themes make a triumphant return, along with a few returning alpha character themes. By Street Fighter IV's console launch year of 2009, it would have been almost 15 years since these original character themes had been featured in a new Street Fighter game. That's a long time. During Street Fighter's near-decade-long nap, highly restrictive data storage limitations in video game soundtrack development largely became a thing of the past. Big-ass hard drives were becoming cheaper to produce, and games could be shipped on Blu-rays and/or multiple DVDs, meaning CD-quality sound bit rates had become closer to the norm instead of a rare novelty like in the arranged versions of the Alpha and Street Fighter III soundtracks we looked at earlier. Composers were no longer stuck deciding between exclusively computer-based synthesis like Street Fighter I, II, and the Alpha series, nor highly compressed, low bitrate audio tracks like in the Street Fighter III series. This meant that from an audio fidelity standpoint, the music of Street Fighter IV was technically limitless. The person in charge of the truly Herculean task of rearranging all of the classic Fighters themes, as well as composing a boatload of new tracks, was Hideyuki Fukasawa. Having previously contributed a single arrangement to the Street Fighter III New Generation Arrange album, his work on Street Fighter IV was by all intents and purposes Fukasawa's first proper foray into the world of Street Fighter, and boy did he leave his mark. Fukasawa would go on to define and dominate the Capcom fighting game sound for the following decade, largely through musical conventions he established in the very first release of Street Fighter IV. For the mid-2000s, Fukasawa's sound was an exciting new take on Street Fighter music. His style blends two seemingly incongruous approaches: cinematic and realistic sounding instrumentation paired with heavy electronica techniques such as aggressive gated synth pads, Eurobeat-inspired production, and anthemic chunky drum and bass grooves. It's big, it's extremely loud and in your face, which successfully captures the spirit of the literally larger-than-life body proportions and personalities of the Street Fighter IV cast. But because of that new technological freedom, Fukasawa can have both an aggressive electronica tempo with much richer instrumentation variety than we've seen before in the series, which allows the fighters' distinct personalities and cultures to really come through the music. It's a far cry from Street Fighter II's simplistic synths and audio samples, which forced the composers to rely instead on rudimentary Western harmonic assumptions of what certain cultures should sound like to convey the game's diverse array of nationalities. The sampled instruments Fukasawa employs in Street Fighter IV, however, sound much closer to the real thing, allowing for far more effective and accurate evocation of disparate cultures and identities. In an interview with VGMOnline.net, Fukasawa explains his approach as getting an idea for the rhythm of a country or setting, and then to use instruments specifically from that country to play the melodies. Vega's theme, for example, has never sounded more Spanish, thanks to the nylon string guitars and the claves in the rhythm section, paired with the accordion playing the lead. Or Dalsam's main melody, which is doubled on a sitar with fast percussive tablas, a relentless companion from beginning to end. A lone treble voice comes in and out throughout the track, adding a lot of tension and friction more common in actual Indian musical harmony, almost entirely absent in the Street Fighter II original. Hideyuki Fukasawa also readily embraces heavier rock arrangements, with Adon getting a very faithful rendition of his Alpha-era theme, except the inclusion of live guitars and drums means it has infinitely more menace and bite than Setsuo Yamamoto's synth guitar original. Rose's Alpha theme, which already sounded like a Final Fantasy boss track, really encapsulates Fukasawa's broad range of expertise. Fast, proggy guitar lines and an organ take turns carrying the lead, and a massive strings section adds to the gravitas. All the while, frenetic synth layers and big drum beats carry the whole thing forward. A personal highlight for me is Fukasawa's perfectly realized version of Dan's theme. With its immaculate emulation of a late 80s New Jack swing beat and pitch-bent synth stabs, it wonderfully complements the character's washed-up, dated characteristics. The lead guitar, too, is as beautifully expressive as ever, but it's so thin and narrow in the mix, just like his wimpy Gadoken. But Fukasawa certainly hasn't forsaken synthesizer-heavy arrangements either. Ryu and Ken's themes, for example, eschew any form of realistic instrumentation and instead lean into the fact that these two are the poster boys of what is ultimately an old-school arcade video game franchise. Street Fighter IV also included some brand new characters, which meant Fukasawa had several opportunities to compose character themes that weren't beholden to the series' legacy. While I personally don't feel any of these compositions match the series' melodic highs, they are of a consistent quality that doesn't stand out from the pack. I'll give a shout out to his theme for newcomer Crimson Viper for its use of a vocoder as the lead instrument. The vocoder is an instrument effect that blends human speech with synthesis, which creates a pretty novel and to this day futuristic sounding effect. This suits C. Viper's own novel reliance on gizmos and gadgets to get the upper hand in fights. Her fighting style is a mixture of human and tech, which is exactly what the vocoder is. All told, Fukasawa has done a great job taking all these character themes coming from over half a dozen different composers and games and unifying them within this recognizably modern Street Fighter IV sound umbrella. There's a massive variety of instrumentation here, but because of that overall very consistent electronica production, nothing feels all that out of place, nor all that surprising. Of course, there are pluses and minuses to this approach, and nowhere is this more demonstrative than in Fukasawa's arrangement of Chun-Li's theme. From the jump, we have a brand new intro. There's a dark new minor key melody played on what I think is a young Qing. The fast-paced notes swirl around the stereoscopic soundstage, evoking Chun-Li's swift grace, punctuated with hard orchestra string stabs. By this point, we're used to having Chun-Li's music open with fast, quick arpeggiation, although this one is noticeably darker than usual. After 8 bars, the big beats fill in, giving it that patented Street Fighter IV sound, while a very prominent Chinese flute reverberates across the mix. The darker Young Qing riff is replaced with the arpeggio from the Street Fighter II version. From there, the piece more closely follows the first verse structure of Yoko Shimomura's original theme. with the other character themes we've looked at, here too the iconic lead melody is performed on a regionally more accurate sound source. For Chun-Li, that would be a virtual instrument meant to sound like the uniquely Chinese erhu. Following the first verse, the track strips down to the intro's softer percussion as the original Shimomura intro riff takes center stage. Afterward, we get an extended duet between the erhu and the flute as the heavier percussion builds up again. From there, the piece loops. Like with Naoshi Mizuta's alpha arrangement of her theme, it lacks the tonally more expressive second and third verses found in the original. But unlike the alpha version, which compensates for its structural simplicity with expressive and varied jazz chords, this version sticks to Street Fighter II's more simplistic chord progression, meaning that beyond its vastly improved sound fidelity, it is both a more repetitive arrangement than the 2 version and less subversive than alpha's. While a safe and simplified variation of her theme isn't the most exciting thing on the planet, I think it's perfectly in line with what Street Fighter IV was going for. This was a game that was attempting to recapture the glory days of Street Fighter's past with a slick new coat of polygonal paint, and that's exactly what Fukasawa delivers with Chun-Li's theme. The reproductions of traditional Chinese instruments brings her theme to life in ways we hadn't been able to hear before, and the little bits of newness, such as the intro, are inoffensive and help lean into the game's more aggressive image. Similarly, this was a reintroduction of her theme after a long dormant period, and so Fukasawa wasn't wrong to home in on the original theme's most iconic parts and shaving off the less memorable second and third verses. Capcom wanted Street Fighter to be a mass-market success again, and viewed through that lens, the reasons behind some of these concessions on the soundtrack become that much clearer. Another sign of Capcom going big with the music, Street Fighter IV opens not with an in-house composition, but with a huge pop song by the mega multi-platinum Japanese boy band Exile. Yeah, their hit The Next Door was a huge part of the sound identity of the first release of Street Fighter IV. The game's opening video is based around it, and beyond that, there are also new arrangements of the tune used in the game's main menu and character select screen. The latter two were arranged by Ken Harada, who already had experience both writing and arranging tracks for the band. For the game's international release, considering the era this came out, you might expect Capcom would have subbed out the track for something more appealing to mainstream Western audiences, like an equivalent Flavor of the Week metal band or something. Street Fighter IV's contemporary, Final Fantasy XIII, did exactly that, substituting the game's J-pop ballad for a Western pop song and star in an attempt to make it more palatable to a massive audience that had next to no interest or knowledge of mainstream Japanese pop stars. Keep in mind, this is the late aughts, a brief drought when the appeal of boy bands wasn't what it once was, nor what it would soon become. But no, Capcom totally commits to it and sticks with Exile. Although it helps that they do produce an English-language version of the track, which transforms the chorus title line from Open the Next Door to Indestructible, and thus was a highly catchy earworm made and forever lodged in many a player's minds. While The Next Door was the de facto theme of the original release of Street Fighter IV, it should be noted that Fukasawa had also written his own main theme for Street Fighter IV. You can hear it briefly in the back half of the opening video and in the game's credits, but it's best remembered for its use as the music for the epic Volcanic Rim stage. Yeah, that goes hard. Perhaps Perhaps due to licensing reasons, following the vanilla release of Street Fighter IV, Exile's track and its many arrangements would become excluded from future iterations of Street Fighter IV, meaning Fukasawa's main theme only grew more prominent and recognizable as the years went on. But the SF4 main theme wasn't Fukasawa's most prominent composition either. Along with creating modernized arrangements of all the classic Fighters themes, composing new themes for the newcomers, he was also in charge of composing and arranging brand new themes for each of the game's stages, effectively doubling the amount of music of a typical Street Fighter game. That's right, character themes and stage themes. This is a real shakeup of a recurring tension present in all Street Fighter titles up until this point, including 1987 Street Fighter I. Is the music representing the fighter, the stage, or both? As we've seen earlier, that answer varies greatly from one title to the next, although now Street Fighter IV provides its own definitive answer. By giving each character their own theme and each stage their own theme, Fukasawa has musically decoupled the intrinsic link between a fighter and their nationality, thus allowing for potentially more nuanced depictions of self-identity and ethnicities going forward. Or at least on paper. The China stage follows a very similar blueprint to Chun-Li's theme, with a fast Yangqing intro based around a major pentatonic scale, followed by a slower, catchy main melody. If Chun-Li's Shimamura theme hadn't also been included, this could easily have passed as a new theme for her. However, other stage themes offer Street Fighter IV an opportunity to showcase additional cultures and music genres that wouldn't have fit were every stage theme required to also represent a specific fighter. The Small Airfield stage takes place in Central Africa, a region that is not represented by any of Street Fighter IV's fighters. Although being an airfield, it is ostensibly Guile's stage. But since Guile is already privy to his own theme, it means Fukasawa isn't forced to make this Africa-based stage theme about Guile or America. Instead, the Small Airfield theme is this very fun, upbeat piece with a more African-inspired chanting and percussion, along with a jovial flute line. It's so much fun. One of Street Fighter IV's more visually striking levels is the beautiful Bay stage set in Vietnam. Another country with no world warrior to represent it. We can't know for sure what a Vietnamese fighter might sound like, but Fukasawa's stage theme might give us a hint. The track starts with a chorus of what sounds to me like a band of haggling fishermen, while a fun mishmash of a multi-tonal wooden percussive instrument and a chunky breakbeat set the stage. Fukasawa clearly puts a lot of emphasis on selecting instruments relevant to the characters and stages, so it's possible that percussive wooden instrument sound he's going for is the turung, a Vietnamese wooden xylophone. Similarly, the track's beautiful jangling main melody is played on an instrument patch that evokes the dan trang, a 16-string Vietnamese zither. Whether or not these are accurate facsimiles is a question better left to an expert, but to me it's clear that the many unique stage themes greatly increases the amount of cultural and musical variety that a single Street Fighter title has ever offered. In a way, it's a return to form for a series that has always strived to evoke that feeling of an exotic world tour. Another full circle moment is the return of the critical variant. If you recall, in Street Fighter II, once a fighter's health reached the critical threshold, the soundtrack would switch to a faster, more tension-filled arrangement of the current battle theme. This was a very novel and dramatic addition, and its absence in the Alpha and SF3 games felt pretty noticeable. For Street Fighter IV, however, it's finally back. Let's use the Small Airfield stage again as an example. Once one of the fighters' health dips to around 10%, the track seamlessly crossfades to a new, darker, and more urgent section. We have repeating siren-like synths and a handful of chanting voices egging you on to get that victory. It's a short loop that repeats indefinitely until the round is over. I also appreciate that it isn't just the piece's main section repeated with more urgency, like in 2, and is instead a completely unique extension to the stage theme. And that's not all. If you recall, Street Fighter III Third Strike implemented 2 different versions of a theme depending on which round of the battle you were in. Unfortunately, Street Fighter IV doesn't do this, but it does introduce an additional way of adding more dynamism to each stage theme. SF4's 3D camera means the game's special attacks look especially flashy this time around, and the music complements these dramatic moments by having a unique section of the stage theme crossfade in time with the beginning and end of these special attacks. In the case of the small airfield stage, the piece's uplifting, celebratory atmosphere is replaced with a more desperate metallic percussion layer, a slow pulsing fuzzy synth, and an all-new alarming flute line. After the attack, the music crossfades back to its previous standard arrangement or the critical variant if the damage threshold is met. This means one well-placed super move could chain together 3 distinct phases of music. Very cool. That's a lot of potential variability built into each and every stage theme. But just the stage themes. Unfortunately, the character themes always play out statically, regardless of various health bar thresholds. While this is a bit disappointing, it does make a lot of sense if you consider how shockingly little Street Fighter IV makes use of those character themes. In arcade mode, for example, you only ever get to hear a character theme during the one rival battle against a set fighter. For all other battles, regardless of who's fighting, it plays the relevant stage theme and only the stage theme. The same is true of Versus mode, i.e. the mode used in local play. You're only going to hear stage themes. As such, it makes sense why the character themes don't have critical variants and mid-battle dramatic variants. It also explains why they are largely very safe, faithful odes to their original versions. Later versions of Street Fighter IV would include the option to select the character themes instead of the stage themes, but this is an option buried in a sub-menu that you need to unlock first, so even then it's pretty hidden. It really shows that a lot more time has gone into making the stage themes reactive and dynamic compared to the character themes, and that is clearly reflected in how the game prioritizes the two. Oh, and speaking of stage themes, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention what is likely the most important theme in the whole game. That's right, we gotta talk about the training stage music. While Street Fighter IV didn't invent the concept of a training stage, this one here is certainly one of its most well-known, thanks to the ungodly amount of hours players would spend in the training mode. But also, thanks to its sterile, symmetrical design, it became a mainstay in many Street Fighter tournaments, much to the chagrin of everyone else watching. But a generic and impersonal stage is also an interesting opportunity to get a neutral look at something usually less tenable. Once you strip away the culturally diverse locales, aka the street, and its iconic characters, aka the fighters, both of which dominate and influence the game's score, when you get rid of all that, what exactly remains of Street Fighter IV's sound identity? By housing no street nor fighter, the training stage is the closest we have to an impartial judge. Although what we hear in its place shouldn't be too surprising. We've got a groovy electronica jam with heavy four-to-the-floor kicks and a half-dozen different synthesizer layers. purely digital sounding with zero recognizable real or sampled instruments. If Fukasawa uses regional instruments as a stand-in for culture and identity, its absence here only further proves the point. The audio mix too is more spacious than most Street Fighter IV tracks, evoking the open, empty feel of the stage. And it's not just a mixing thing either. Another thing that sets this composition apart is its lack of a strong central melody. Sure, there are lots of very catchy synth arps, and the fuzzy bass synths slides around in a melodic manner, but overall the track doesn't lead with its melody, which is the antithesis of how the vast majority of both character and stage themes function. So again, the absence makes thematic sense. But more than just thematic sense, it also makes functional sense. Fukasawa seems to understand that this stage theme is one that players will be forced to hear over and over again. Adding a very strong, identifiable melody that would repeat for hours on end would have been a recipe for disaster. Building the track around a strong groove instead was absolutely the right call, and speaks to Fukasawa's talent not just as a competent arranger of classic Street Fighter tracks, but also in his ability to understand what is actually important in the moment-to-moment of actually playing a Street Fighter game. Had Street Fighter IV bombed in sales, and if that vanilla console release had been the only version of the game that saw the light of day, there was already way more than enough in there to cement Hideyuki Fukasawa as a fantastic torchbearer of the Street Fighter sound. However, Street Fighter IV decidedly did not bomb, and was in fact a certified smash hit. During the many years following its release, Capcom would slip back into a familiar pattern of iterating on Street Fighter IV in rapid succession. 2010 would see the release of both Super Street Fighter IV and Super Street Fighter IV Arcade Edition, which are a more accurate encapsulation of Street Fighter IV's legacy. Exile's Indestructible proved to be quite destructible, actually, which meant you could now hear Fukasawa's Street Fighter IV main theme across the opening video in various game menus and of course the credits. It was hard to miss now. The removal of Indestructible also meant Fukasawa needed a new theme for the character select menus, which previously used a variation of Exile's track. For my money, the one Fukasawa came up with for Super Street Fighter IV is up there as one of the most hype character select screens in all of gaming. Hot damn, that is good. In arcade mode, Super Street Fighter IV also introduced all new opening and closing animations and music for each of the fighters. This is a cool addition, although it means that those original vanilla arcade mode cutscenes are to this day still stuck on the very first console release of the game. I hope you kept your copy. Way more important than new story mode cutscenes, however, was the game's new characters. While Capcom had spent the decade ignoring and trying to make everyone forget about Street Fighter III, Super Street Fighter IV finally saw the return of some of its original fighters. This meant Fukasawa now found himself tasked with arranging Hideyuki Okugawa and eventually Yuki Iwai's awesome SF3 era themes. These are mostly faithful rearrangements, but he puts a few personal touches here and there that help them stand out. At one end, we have Makoto's theme, which is just about as close as he gets to a one-to-one glow-up that does justice to the Third Strike original. Elsewhere, Dudley's theme gets a Daft Punkian makeover thanks to the inclusion of a vocal layer, compelling you to do what the original simply implied.
Get on the dance floor. Get on the dance floor. Get on the dance floor. Get on.
Ibuki's theme might be the most interesting, though. The Third Strike original has this mysterious and subtle lo-fi energy, which Fukasawa turns into a more approachable and definitely more cleanly produced jam. To me, a lot of the mystique of the original is lost, but I can't say I hate it either. If you remember, I used Ibuki's Third Strike theme as a way to showcase how that game had two different arrangements based on which round you were in. I actually think Fukasawa's SF4 instrumentation does a better job than Okugawa's original at differentiating those two halves, mostly thanks to him pulling the drum beat back in the second half. Although, ironically, since Street Fighter IV doesn't actually have per-round song variants, the two halves of Ibuki's theme flow into each other regardless of what round you're in. The track is entirely static. Super Street Fighter IV would include those three SF3 era characters, although by the time we got to Street Fighter IV's final revision in 2014, that number would more than double. It's nice to see Capcom seemingly making peace with the fact that, even though SF3 was not a sales juggernaut, from a character, music, and culture standpoint, it's a wildly influential and important part of the Street Fighter legacy. Although Street Fighter III's poster boy Alex never did make it into Street Fighter IV, so I guess we'll never get to hear a modern version of the iconic Jazzy NYC. Going back to the new Super SF4 characters for a minute, another crucial addition was the all-new fighter Juri Han. A South Korean Taekwondo martial artist, Juri was designed as a twisted reflection of Chun-Li and functioned as her constant foil. She is also arguably the most popular Street Fighter character introduced in the 21st century. If Street Fighter IV could be seen as mostly cashing in on series nostalgia, Juri was the first explicit sign of what the series' future might look like. And let me tell you, it's looking like a lot of With Juri being a twisted, sadistic inversion of Chun-Li, let's take a look at how Fukasawa went about composing her theme. This thing starts big, loud, and dark, with a distorted, disconcerting woman's cry coming in at a few key points. The main melody is fast, slippery, and occasionally dissonant, all of which is a good reflection of her own abrasive, in-your-face personality. However, there's a surprise bridge breakdown section that betrays the track's otherwise very villainous flavor. Here, the intensity softens, and we are introduced to a melancholic piano line and a harpsichord arpeggio. Hints of her repressed, tragic past, and a clue that there is more to Juri than her dark and sinister exterior leads on. Then, the woman's voice screams out again. Juri puts her mask back on as the dark, aggressive mix returns. It's a brief glimpse at her real personality, and frankly tells you more about the character than the game's scant arcade story mode does. Like with prior Street Fighter titles, Capcom would port the game to portable platforms too. 2011 Super Street Fighter IV 3D Edition for the Nintendo 3DS deserves the highest of praise for being a gorgeous, faithful port of the game, although it did need to make a couple sacrifices to the stages for it to run in glorious 60 frames per second. For one, the backgrounds were no longer animated, and similarly, the stage themes no longer had critical variance or dramatic variance. Like the now static backgrounds, the music always plays out the same from the beginning to the end of the battle. This was also the first new Street Fighter game since the smartphone revolution. So of course Capcom would release Street Fighter IV not once, nor twice, but 3 times on iOS. Just like with the 3DS version, the audio-visual presentation of the backgrounds is entirely static, but it's otherwise a pretty impressive feat. By 2014, Capcom would release their final version of the game, known as Ultra Street Fighter IV.
Ultra Street Fighter 4!
By then, the character roster had ballooned to 44 fighters, each with their own theme. Even more impressive from a musical standpoint, there were also over 30 levels to choose from, each of which has their own dynamic theme with 2 variable triggers. The sheer variety of stages also means Street Fighter IV sometimes gets to depict more than one specific aspect of a country or culture. Across the 4 USA stages, for example, we get to fight at a drive-in theater, a skyscraper construction site, a skateboard halfpipe,
Come so far, and this is the showdown. Now I really know I gotta stand my ground. Face to face with my destiny. I see it in the eyes of my enemies.
and also at a kabuki show. The instrumentation on that last stage theme uses exclusively traditional Japanese instruments, but again, the level isn't depicting Japan at all, but USA. You can argue that level is mostly just played for laughs, especially since the subversive Japanophile alpha character Sodom can be seen in the background of the stage, but it's also true that you can see kabuki shows in North America. Having Street Fighter IV depict this, gag or not, as one of USA's many sides is a sign of cultural nuance rare for the series up to this point. You also get a perfect inversion of this in the Japanese stages. The old temple and overpass stages evoke the primary Japanese dichotomy of tradition versus technology, with the former having a primarily traditional Japanese instrumentation, while the latter is exclusively modern-sounding synthesizers and a Hatsune Miku-style Vocaloid effect for the lead melody. That's all cool, but then there's also the Pit Stop 109, which is this frankly bizarre mixture of very America-coded trucker culture, but through a traditional Japanese aesthetic. But then it's also like a music festival in a parking lot? But then the theme is this very country western sort of thing? I don't know, man. It's mega weird and completely defies Street Fighter's typically simple and compartmentalized definitions of countries and cultures. We're getting more nuanced and blended expressions of subcultures, which I think is cool for a series that aims, however simplistically, to represent the best parts of what the world has to offer. Another exciting change in Ultra is how the game handles the stage theme's dramatic variant audio cues. In the preceding versions of 4, that unique section of music would only play for the duration of a super move's animation. The downside of this was that you never got to hear all that much of these exclusive bars of music. In Ultra, however, they've added a new trigger for it. If both fighters' health bars are below 50% but above the 10% critical threshold, this dramatic variant completely replaces the track's main arrangement. think this is a fantastic change. Having the trigger requirements be so specific and easy to miss means the game is rewarding a competitive and well-balanced match. Outside of a handful of early arrangements of Exile's The Next Door by Ken Harada, it really is quite impressive that Hideyuki Fukasawa remained Street Fighter IV's sole composer and arranger across the game's 7+ year run. It's something we'd never see again, with Street Fighter V and VI instead returning to the larger sound team approach of the series' earlier titles. It's truly quite an accomplishment by Fukasawa, but if that wasn't enough, in between Super and Ultra Street Fighter IV, he was also the main composer and arranger on Capcom's two other big fighting games from that era, 2011's Marvel vs. Capcom 3 and 2012's Street Fighter Cross Tekken. Fukasawa's brand of heavy electronica grooves, varied regional instrumentation, and inspired use of dynamic audio variants single-handedly defined the first decade and a half of Capcom's 21st century fighting game sound. But what to make of little old Chun-Li? The 90s saw iteration after iteration of how to musically represent the character, from Yoko Shimomura's emphasis on Chinese culture to Naoshi Mizuta's jazz popification of it, to Yuki Iwai and Hideyuki Okugawa each taking it into completely new and bold directions. By comparison, Fukasawa's Street Fighter IV run, which lasted nearly as long as all those preceding titles combined, only gave us that one refreshing but safe, static arrangement of the Shimomura original, which, of course, is perfectly in line with Street Fighter IV's music priorities. Each character gets a refreshing modern take on their new or pre-existing theme, with an emphasis on a wide array of regional instruments to convey their cultures and personalities. But they were also short and to the point, with no dynamic transitions or variations. By comparison, the stage themes benefited from more technical dynamism and a broader palette of cultures to pull from. Whether or not prioritizing stage themes over character themes was the right call will depend on each player. As for Fukasawa, his role with the Street Fighter series was far from done. Street Fighter IV proved to be a massive hit, but its sequel would hit all sorts of bumps and turbulent winds on its road to success. But that's a story for another time. Initially, I had planned to cover Street Fighter IV, V, and VI in this video, but halfway through writing this script, I realized I had way too much to say about each of those games. So I hope this video covering just one game wasn't too self-indulgent. Music analysis videos on YouTube, especially long-form ones like this one, are massive time commitments and are often demonetized by the music's copyright holders. As such, the only reliable way to make an income making these types of videos is through Patreon. If you're enjoying the Street Fighter Music Retrospective series, I would be very grateful for your support over there so that I can keep going with this series. I really want to make videos on Street Fighter V and VI, and if I can get a few new patrons thanks to this video here, that would seal the deal. If you can't swing it financially, I totally get it. Liking, commenting, and subscribing are of course all hugely helpful as well. Same with sharing it on Reddit and Discord. Also, if you don't know what to comment, tell me what your favorite Street Fighter IV stage theme is. Mine is probably the Solar Eclipse stage, which I'm realizing now I didn't actually mention once. Damn. Okay, this is a note to the future me who is editing this video to make sure to include that track at least once in the video. Alright, talk to you soon. Take care. Bye.